When we consider labor relations and unions in a global context, we have to think about the influence of multinational corporations. Essentially, these are corporations that work across borders and are often considered a stateless corporation because the high degree of assets that these corporations have spread across the globe in areas outside of their home countries. And these companies have a number of advantages in business. One is that they can spread out their process of manufacturing and services, and that allows them to bypass protective tariffs that countries have set up because they have part of their production process within a country and therefore are not subject. Another benefit is that they can choose which countries they go into that have labor laws that are favorable towards their businesses. And by spreading out their capabilities across many countries, they can weaken the influence of unions. We can see in this graph that's in Exhibit 14.1 the different wage rates in countries across the world and how that has fluctuated over the last 30 years. Again, at the top we've got the United States. These other countries in those middle rows under 1980, 1990, 2005, and 2009, those show the percentage of the hourly compensation costs compared to the United States. One under the United States there is Canada, and you would think it would be quite similar. And you can see, in fact, that it has been fairly similar in terms of the cost of compensation for manufacturing workers. But you look at other countries that are still developing, like Brazil and Mexico and Singapore, Portugal, and Spain. You can see that those countries have a much lower cost for hourly compensation than the United States does. In contrast, also, you can look at many of the European countries like Austria and Belgium and France and Germany, and these countries tend to have a higher cost for production workers than the United States. So again, the advantage of a multinational company is that they can move their production and shift costs that may have been higher in terms of labor and move to lower labor cost countries. Organized labor has made many criticisms of multinational corporations. One is that corporations have, they say that corporations have some responsibility to the countries in which they exist, especially those countries in which they're based. And unions would argue that multinational corporations do as much as they can to minimize their contribution to those countries, and therefore there's an undermining of the infrastructure within countries like the United States because resources have been diverted away from where they used to come from these large corporations. They also say that they use the technology that has been created in the United States, many times technology that has been created through taxpayer investments. Taxpayer entities like NASA and the U.S. military are great innovators of technology that are often later commercialized. And there's an argument that this investment in technology is not being realized in the United States. And therefore that these companies are exploiting the taxpayers' investment in technology by exporting these technologies. They also say that by setting up these structures where there are um, long supply chains and creation of different parts of a whole product in different countries, that they're undermining the U.S. wage standards, that they are taking parts where that would be made by higher paid U.S. employees and shipping those off to low wage companies. There's often the criticism that there is a trade imbalance and that we are importing much more than we're exporting. And there's an economic problem with that, but there could also be a problem in terms of our country's sustainability and our security. If we look at World War II, much of our victory over the Axis nations came from our ability to outproduce those countries. And if we were put in the same position today, we would not have the same capacity to produce, because so much of our industrial production has been outsourced to foreign countries. So unions tend to be at a disadvantage when they're dealing with multinational corporations. So because the supply chains are so spread out and they have options in terms of where to produce their goods and services, strikes are not as much of a threat to multinational corporations. And multinational corporations can push unions into concessions because they will compare the wages and benefits that they can offer in foreign countries to those in the higher priced domestic home-based countries, and therefore they can push back wages. And in many multinational companies, they have highly centralized power structures, and this makes it difficult to negotiate with local managers, and so that also limits the ability for unions to negotiate. And multinational corporations can use clever accounting tricks to hide information from the union, so it's harder for unions to understand what is the profit that is being achieved, and it's harder then to demand that workers get their fair share of that profit, because multinational companies, through subsidiaries in different foreign countries, can hide the profits that they have offshore in ways that make them invisible to the public and the union. So how do unions work with multinational companies? Well, they try and create some transnational bargaining across borders. The goal here is to lessen competition in low-wage areas and take wage out of the competition. They try and protect their own standards in terms of hours of work and worker safety and worker rights. And so this can be done through collective bargaining, where unions try and organize across borders in order to achieve consistency in what bargaining units demand in different countries. It can also take place through legislations, through enforcing the codes of conduct for multinational corporations, making them have consistent codes of conduct. And we've seen some of this come into play in the creation of the European Union, which is a more highly unionized area. We'll see is that the European countries tend to be more highly unionized, and so there's been more consistency in terms of labor standards across Europe because of the European Union. We've also seen other organizations like the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, but it has been difficult outside of Europe to really get much traction in terms of getting legislation to make consistent codes of conduct in multinational corporations. Certainly in the United States, there has not been much advancement in that. Now, of course, employers don't like multinational bargaining. They don't want this transnational bargaining because it would give unions greater power for shutting down production, and it would make negotiations more complex and having to exist on multiple levels. There's also many obstacles to unions bargaining in multinational corporations. There are different laws in different countries. There is no central controlling authority like there is in the United States with the National Labor Relations Board. There is no international labor relations board that can settle disputes. There are many cultural differences in terms of how people value unions. Certainly in some countries there are strong values against unionization, and it's very difficult to coordinate activities across countries because of communication differences, language differences, time differences across countries. And of course, different nations have very different priorities. Again, we can look at Europe that has a very strong support for unionization to other countries that really have laws that do not support unionization at all. And of course, there is fairly steady employer resistance to unions. Now, when we look at the growth of multinational corporations, part of this has been because of legislation in the form of free trade agreements, basically agreements between countries. This really started with the North America Free Trade Agreement, but we have seen subsequent free trade agreements with Central America, and now we're seeing it with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We look at NAFTA, which kind of set the standards. This was an agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States that removed tariffs and trade barriers and allowed the marketplace to become more seamless between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. What was the effect of that? Well, we saw a lot of job losses in the U.S. manufacturing sector and the Mexican farming markets. And so there was a trade-off. I mean, the U.S. did gain in terms of farming, but lost in terms of manufacturing. There was quite a bit of development in Mexico in terms of manufacturing and developing export-oriented manufacturing plants in Mexico. But it did not result in significant changes in wages or the loss of jobs in lower wage areas, mainly in those high wage areas like manufacturing. Now, free trade agreements resulted in also labor cooperation. So NAFTA side agreements committed the three nations to the protection of labor principles. But when we look at this labor cooperation, these shared labor standards, they really weren't effective because there really was no enforcement mechanism. It was just countries having to proactively object, and there was little remedy to those legal rights. And we saw that it was very difficult to sanction NAFTA governments when they violated the principles of the labor cooperations. So we see the types of principles that were talked about. Many of the rights that we have in the United States are often protected in these labor agreements, like the North American Free Trade Agreement. But what happens is that those who are responsible for filing grievances are the government, and they don't tend to do it. And the process for legislating and airing those grievances is very difficult. And so there hasn't been really anything of much substance in ever filed in terms of violation of these principles, and not because the principles have been adhered to, because they have not been enforced.